Madam Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters, guests. The past couple weeks have been a boon to political junkies, both minor and major. Last week, the Republicans at their convention selected Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan as their presidential and vice presidential nominees. This week, the Democrats at their convention renominated Barack Obama and Joe Biden as their presidential and vice presidential standard bearers. Now, national political conventions have been part of our presidential selection process for almost 200 years. But this year, fewer Americans took time out of their day to watch the conventions. Now, in part, that could be to reduce coverage by the national broadcasting companies, or perhaps they're just tired from the long process, nearly year-long process it takes in caucuses and primaries that finally get us to the convention. And of course, there are some who look at the conventions and all they see is overly expensive, tightly scripted, carefully choreographed infomercials on behalf of the parties and their nominees. So let's take a real quick look at the history of conventions. Now, back in the early 19th century, nominees were selected by party leaders in consultation with their congressional delegations. So think here, cigar-chomping Pauls in smoke-filled back rooms, negotiating, arm-twisting, exchanging favors and patronage for choices for their candidate. Of course, by the mid-1820s, this process started to break down, because as the country grew, there developed a lot of sectional differences that couldn't be overcome by this method. Actually, one party was so fractionalized, they actually had 4 nominees that year. So in 1832, the first convention came into play. The whole idea behind the convention was to gather the party faithful so they could all coalesce around a single candidate. So delegates were welcomed from all over the country, and the public was invited to watch. Now, these were important, dramatic events for the political process. But despite that, transparency was not a hallmark of any of their proceedings. Party bosses still controlled the heart of the nominating process. But one major difference separated that from the pre-convention time, and that was the delegates, the ones who actually cast the vote, did it on the convention floor, witnessed by everybody. So, this created, lost my track. Okay, so now electing a party nominee was hard work. It often took many rounds of negotiations and a lot of ballots before they could select a nominee. As a matter of fact, one party took 103 ballots before they selected their nominee, who went on to lose in that year's presidential election. So, by the 19th century, though, reform had started. And in 1904, Florida held the first binding primary. Other states soon followed. But the party bosses weren't exactly eager to give up the influence they had. For example, in the 1912 Republican Convention, former President Theodore Roosevelt, who won 9 of 12 Republican primaries that year, was beat out by William Howard Taft, the incumbent president, because Taft controlled the party apparatus, and with that, the Credentials Committee. And they were able to deny seating to a number sufficient enough of Roosevelt's contested delegates. Taft was able to win the election. Really, in recently as 1968, party bosses still had a lot of control over the elections. That year, Vice President Hubert Humphrey won the nomination despite not having run in a single primary. Of course, that caused a great deal of hate and discontent at that year's Democratic National Convention. So following that convention, both parties effectively removed, for the most part, control of the party leadership from selecting their nominees. And they adopted primaries, whereby delegates were apportioned based on the performance of candidates in elections. Well, for the most part, because actually in 1976, at the Republican Convention, neither Jerry Ford nor Ronald Reagan had enough pledged delegates going into the convention where either one of them was the settled upon nominee. So we saw a classic convention again, where you had backroom deals, negotiations, arm twisting, and actually President Ford using the perks of his office to sway delegates. And in the end, he won out. So today, we really know who our presidential nominees are well in advance of the conventions. And in the past couple conventions, we've actually identified who our vice presidential nominees are. So in many cases, this process has somewhat robbed us of the excitement and drama that we've seen in presidential elections and in the conventions. So many people think, well, why do we even bother to have conventions anymore? And so some of the reasons we continue to have conventions are, first of all, the parties still have to nominate and confirm presidential and vice presidential candidates. Second, they still have to have a platform they have to put together and establish rules for the next election. Conventions are the best place to do that. It also offers a great opportunity to have party unity. And it provides unfiltered venue for the candidates and the parties to get their message out to the electorate. So national conventions still have a role to play in our election. I think they're important. I think they're going to be here for a long time to come. Madam Postmaster.